other things as well. Y'all are the subject matter experts. So so bring up other things that you have as well. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Classic Monsters and Horror Games, a panel for the A Weekend with Good Friends gaming convention hosted on the Good Friends of Jackson Elias Discord server. On behalf of the convention staff and our panelists, I would like to welcome you to today's discussion. I am your moderator, Rina Haenze from the Old Ways podcast and Ain't Slayed Nobody. But that's enough about me. We have some wonderful panelists here that I will get to introduce themselves. So we'll start off with Perry.
Oh, hello. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist. My practice is Untangle and Grow Counseling in San Francisco Bay Area. Otherwise, I run a podcast called Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered, which deals with mental health and the intersection of a number of topics, which includes gaming and geekdom as well. And I'm one of the players and casts on Symphony Entertainment periodically, and also trying to write my first scenario as well.
Thanks for joining us, Perry. And Sue?
I'm Sue Savage. Pronouns are she, her. I'm a scenario writer, and you can find some of my stuff on DriveThruRPG if you search for my name, Sue Savage. I write urban fantasy adventures for the game Liminal. I also wrote my own cozy mystery RPG, Matrons of Mystery, and you can see me occasionally appearing on Symphony Entertainment on streamed games.
JR?
Hi, I'm Jason Fryer, he, him, writer, game designer, and general curmudgeon. Any award winner and nominated writer for Cult Divinity Lost and other role-playing games. Currently, you can find me on a Lost Caravan, either as a player or running with Blood-Dipped Wings, Cult Divinity Lost Actual Play.
And last but not least, Stephen.
Hi, my name's Stephen Wall. I'm a PhD in folklore from Memorial University, Newfoundland, and I run a small blog with essays on it called Delapore Media, discussing verisimilitude and role-playing games and how to, create better, more realistic role-playing games. That's kind of my goal there. And I've stepped away from academia, and I am settling into a new life as a Lovecraftian weirdo. And that's my journey thus far.
That's wonderful. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Our discussion in this panel is going to be on the use of, as the title suggests, classic monsters in horror games. The first half of our discussion, I'd like to talk about deep focus on classic monsters themselves, what they are, their place in the public consciousness, and so on. In the second half, we'll talk more about how we use them in games, if that sounds good to everybody. So first off, we kind of need to define what a classic monster is. What are the sorts of creatures and monsters that we use under this term? What makes them a classic monster, and so on and so forth. So anyone who wants to jump in, what would you say a classic monster is?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. If that's okay, I'll start with, and people can bounce off of this if they like. I would kind of look at the cast of the 1930s through 1950s Universal monster catalog. You could look at Dracula, of course. You could look at the Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy, and those sort of characters. You could even kind of go back into earlier film, kind of black and white film. You might look at like the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and sort of like the evil mesmerist type figure, who's sort of monstrous in his own way. That's where I would start. I mean, if anybody wants to jump off of that, feel free. That's just kind of my first thought.
That's pretty close to the list that I wrote.
Okay.
Largely things that show up in classic horror movies. I also made a note of folkloric monsters, because these are all things we've been telling stories about for even longer than we've had film. So things like fairies, ghosts, and witches.
Yeah.
So my other thought is that what you consider a classic monster very much depends on your culture. Because I figure if you grew up in Japan, your idea of classic movie monsters is going to be very different to mine.
That was a conversation my partner and I were having this morning about the idea of Godzilla as being a classic monster. But in some ways, he is a classic monster, but he's a classic monster of the modern age. And so I would break it down into who are the classic monsters of the modern age, which would include things like Godzilla or Invasion of the Body Snatchers with the pod monsters from outer space, to the film classic monsters, which is the Universal, then to our literary and antiquity classic monsters, which also fit into the folklore standpoint too.
You could also throw in maybe certain cryptids. I think you mentioned Godzilla, and it immediately got me thinking of the Loch Ness monster. And of course, Nessie's a classic monster, obviously. Same with the various kind of dinosaurs hidden in remote locales and all of that. That whole trope, that's a very classic monster.
I've always approached classic monsters kind of like from the core 5 archetypes. The Devourer, the Harbinger, the Outsider, the Revenant, and the Shadow, and how they're reflected in our media and in our myth, going back, right from the time that we were drawing images on walls. So maybe I'm going too far back.
Oh, could you tell us a bit more about some of these archetypes?
I guess the easiest way to tie one of a well-known one is the Devourer, which is basically the representation of our unbridled hungers. So the vampire would be the devourer, that basically they are overcome by bloodlust. So Dracula, and blood, basically always needing to consume, and how that can be both horrifying and seductive. And I like stories that explore both aspects of that. Because at any point, if we became like a vampire, how far would we go to satisfy our own hungers? Or the outsider, which would be the wolfman. Basically, they're pushed to the side, but it also reflects a lot of the societal aspects too. And I think that's how classic monsters are so ingrained in our cultures, that they kind of represent features of us and allow us to discuss societal concepts in the realm of horror, rather than, basically saying this, the current concepts. Gives us a little more freedom.
Do y'all have any particular, just for fun, any particular favorite, what you would consider classic monsters, whether it's from any of these different types, as you were just discussing, JR, or you, Perry, the different eras of classic monsters? Do you have any particular favorites?
Mm. Well, then also Sue's points, where does culture come in? And as I've also been doing some of my own just general studies, is like classic werewolf is Eastern European. And yet, if we go further into the idea of a shapeshifter, we have the skinwalkers of Native American and the W monster of Native American folklore. We have the Spider Woman, also of Native American folklore. I know they introduced the jungle leopard or jungle cat in the last Hellboy movie, which is a horrible storyline of that one. David Hubbard's good, but horrible storyline for that one. I didn't know for parts of Africa, there's the idea of the were hyena. So if you did want to throw a classic monster in, what would it mean for your characters to think they're going after a werewolf, but they're actually dealing with a were hyena or a were spider? How would that actually change how they would think about them, the aspect of it? So that's one thought that comes to mind. Otherwise, I mean, the classics, there's also things like Scylla and Charybdis, or Echidna, the mother of monsters in Greek myth as well. How would you put those characters, even if you weren't placing them in your Invictus setting, because I was thinking about that one too for you, Rina, as an aspect of how would the modern person deal with that? How many tomes would they go through to try and understand what this monster is doing and providing for the storyline? To, again, Godzilla, which I think would add to a new class of archetypes there of the utter destroyer. Because Godzilla represents a destruction level that didn't exist in any of these past periods in time, too.
And even like you're saying, that it's a very cultural thing. The archetype of the revenant, the ghost, it has very different meanings between Western and Eastern culture, which is probably why it has such a hard time translating their movies over to us, because we just see a spooky ghost. And that's where the fear is. But the fear in Eastern philosophy is the ghost represents a loss of potential, or basically some kind of sin that has been unresolved, that they are basically trapped. And that emotional connection, that they can never resolve that's the true horror, not boo.
Or even the aspect of the walking undead / zombies, which it comes out of African culture, and the idea that you've got somebody who is not allowing you to move on from the labors of the world. That someone is powerful enough to bring your soul back away from essentially God or the higher being to trap you here on earth in this servitude. So that's a very different concept to everything we've seen from name any number of Walking Dead zombie movies that are out there.
I think whenever I want to deal with a classic monster, I mean, the one thing that I like about them is they tend to be a very plastic. Um, they tend to be very plastic creatures, and you can. I mean, as much as we find them kind of they're stuck in their tropes and all of that, you can actually decide what you want to do within a. I mean, there's a continuum there that you can play with. That's what I guess I'm getting at. And you can go anywhere from lampshading the trope, where you lean very heavily on what your players know about the werewolf or the vampire or what have you, or and almost kind of like wink and nod to the audience as you're presenting this, or you can completely defy the trope. You can pick out, what are your if you want to call them archetypes, what are your ideas of the archetype, and then you can twist them around. What if you have a devouring monster, but that devouring monster is very cute and cuddly?
Oopsie.
A vampire as a 3-year-old girl, or a 3-year-old little girl, is very different than a vampire as a fully grown adult man.
Hmm.
Which I believe is one of the premises of the Iranian, I think it is, film, A Girl Who Walks Alone.
Okay. Don't know that one.
Or something like Girl Who Walks Alone in the Night. It's a variant on the.
Yeah.
It's been a while since
Nope.
I've known it, but that standpoint of there, how does that play itself out, especially as a Middle Eastern cultured vampire?
So we're kind of touching a little bit already on my next question, which is themes and tropes associated with these classic monsters. We've already discussed a little bit of the hunger when it comes to vampires and things of that sort. But what are some other tropes and themes that you see associated with these monsters, particularly ones that would be interesting to use in our games?
I'll let somebody else go first. I'm just processing.
I could start again if you want, or Sue, if you.
Yeah, I'm just looking at my list and seeing what springs to mind. I think Fae are probably the thing I like using most in games, and it's hard to nail down a single theme with Fae because just they are so varied. One of my favourite type of Fae is the children don't fall in the pond and drown Fae, which goes by a wide variety of different names depending on where in the world or even where in the country you are. And I'm just fascinated by the idea of a physical manifestation of a more abstract danger.
Yeah, I've never forgiven Tinkerbell for disrupting the versions of Fae and fairies, because fairies are terrifying if you actually read the literature. If one of them shows up, you're typically in trouble.
Which also goes into how have the fairy creatures also shown up in other cultures as well. Because the classic concept of the elf, which we know if we have thanks to Tolkien, is the Euro version of it, but there are other fey creatures of it, varying different types across the world in every culture. They're just not going to have the same name and appearance or even function the same way. So there's the aspect of how are you looking at a culture's myth, especially if you're not using a Western European setting. And put an example of that, the television show Haven. One of their particular monsters they brought in there was a Caribbean monster. But at no point even though they introduced the monster as being of Caribbean origin, they never stated how this particular person who had the curse with this monster had any connection to the Caribbean. And I'm sitting there watching that, it's like, wait, when did you say this person came from the Caribbean? To have a Caribbean Afrocentric monster be the monster of the week for this, or the problem of the week.
I missed that one.
That's where I think it's worth it sometimes to distinguish between are we using one of these classic monsters, or are we kind of layering the tropes of this classic monster over the top of what is, I guess, quote unquote, real for our campaign, for our scenario? I mean, there's, vampire myths and all of that. You can certainly, again, with lampshading, you can certainly lampshade like a vampire to your group, or your players, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to have that. And I mean, maybe they're prepared with salt and steaks and holy wafers and all of that, but instead you've got something completely alien. It just maybe it's something like the Star Vampire, from Lovecraft and Block. Maybe it does have those traits, and people, you see victims that have lost blood and that sort of thing. But you're not going to be able to deal with a Star Vampire with steaks and holy water. That's, well, I mean, maybe steaks from the butcher, but not the traditional accoutrements. But it can be kind of fun to see your players sort of go off on that angle, and you can use that knowledge against them in some ways, because everybody knows how to deal with a vampire. So you can hang a little bit of bait out there for them, and then come at it from a more kind of cosmic horror Lovecraftian angle, where the trope ends, or the tradition of the monster ends up kind of covering what's really there.
Mhm.
Camouflage.
It really depends on the story you're also trying to tell, because monsters are effectively metaphors, and they can
Mhm.
represent the themes that you're trying to tell in your scenario. And
That's
which
actually,
is why you
yeah.
don't just drop, a vampire into a standard story. The vampire has to have a reason for being there. They have to reflect something.
Yeah.
Pun intended on the reflection for a vampire.
Yes.
Well, and maybe talking about kind of monster as metaphor and monster as meaning, I'll bring the one piece I brought for show and tell today up now, which is Paul Barber's Vampires, Burial, and Death. You can't find this new anymore, but it's all over ABE Books. It costs about $8 US, and it's well, honestly, one of the better resources I've ever come across for role-playing games, despite being an academic book. And really, he goes into where the kind of the vampire myth comes from, that sort of thing. And it comes out of people not understanding how human beings decompose. And he goes through in very graphic detail what happens when you leave a body out to just kind of decompose on its own without any of our modern chemical wonders of the funeral industry to look after it, and how people dealt with this. The fact that a body could move or twitch after death, or gas could escape, and you could hear your dead relative's voice one more time. I mean, granted, they'll just be saying "oh," but you would still hear them. Or what it could mean if we treat the body, we treat human beings as sacred and belonging to God, yet, we can't quite bury grandma deep enough because it's wintertime and the coyotes or the wolves come in and dig her up. What is that? What kind of meaning do we make out of that? And that's where Barber kind of cites kind of the earliest incarnations, at least in Eastern Europe, of the vampire. And I mean, it goes under. It's not called a vampire at that point. It's called things like, in Greek it would be called a vrykolakas, which is kind of this weird combination of a vampire, a revenant, a werewolf. The distinction doesn't really come in until we actually are trying to put these things on a screen and say, this is the Dracula movie, this is the Dracula book, this is the werewolf movie, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Which leads us nicely into the aspect of the funeral practices of other parts of the world with
Mhm.
mummification, to the sky burials of certain sections of Native American, to the Egyptian burial practices were the early forms of the modern chemistry we use today. foreign bombing practices. I mean, there's even still sticking in that sort of classic universal. There's everything we saw with the Brendan Fraser Mummy series too,
Mhm.
and even where sadly the franchise sort of fell apart when they left Egypt and started dealing with China's process and concepts around mummification. And at the end of that movie, they even hinted at what was going on in Peru.
Hmm.
So the standpoint that this is not a unique process, it's just a question of what is the process around what this mommy represents and how is it being used, which also gets into equally what is the emotional value that is trying to be created and addressed in this horror that you're going to use this monster for. Is it a
Bouncing
way
off
of dealing with grief or anger or fear or sadness?
that leads into something I was thinking is why do you think a lot of our classic monsters tend to revolve around the idea of death and loss? And why they keep resonating with us today, because you have vampires, you have mummies, and you have zombies, and even with things like werewolves, you have the loss of the self, right? Where you're becoming something else. You're almost dying to yourself for a bit to become something else. So, why do you think that happened, and why does it appeal to us so much still? Because we still have a bajillion Dracula movies and shows, and mummies everywhere, and 5 million Walking Dead spin-offs. What do y'all think?
Well, Dracula's definitely changed over time. I mean, he started out as, a rotting corpse that, looked kind of like Count Orlok or something like that. He ended up being a suave foreigner in the form of Bela Lugosi. He ended up being kind of an Englishman playing a suave foreigner when the Hammer films got a hold of him. He he ended up as Brad Pitt for a time. He became a sex symbol, and then he eventually got trapped in an endless loop of going to high school.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean it's definitely I mean, where to sit with that, because there's a lot of different things going on there. I think that there is. I think if you want to kind of stick a pin in what the root of it is, or kind of a root potentially. I'm not going to say it's the only one, but there is an otherness quality about it, and I think that's why a lot of monsters, especially in this kind of the silver screen era, got wrapped up in foreignness. The foreign vampire, the foreign mummy, that sort of thing, all kind of the werewolf curse that comes from a foreign place, a non a non Anglo-centered white place. The I think that yeah, death is other. Death is the opposite of us. It is the thing that we are all secretly anxious about. It's in the back of our minds constantly as we live our lives, as we go through kind of the constant existential crisis that is being a human being. And yeah, so I would say that's why death gets tangled up in that. I think that is a reason. I'm not going to say that's the only reason, certainly not, but that's a reason, maybe my reason.
I think it's also a very personal thing because these death-related monsters, they tend to be often it's somebody very close to the protagonist that is being affected by it. And most notably in Dracula, you've got Lucy, who at least 3 of the main cast are in love with. Uh, then on to Mina, who everyone else is in love with. And
Yeah, you are right, Sue. It's a very personal journey. I mean, any of those kind of classic monsters. I mean, even if you take something where like your modern zombie movies are all about hordes of zombies, or at least they have been since Romero kind of got a hold of the trope and transformed that for us. The most terrifying experience, though, is the encounter with the relative or the loved one or the neighbor that used to be your friend and companion and is now this dead creature. That's usually that whenever a film or a book kind of they hang something on that. They hang kind of a plot point on that typically.
Well, always appreciate Guillermo del Toro for taking the vampire trope and completely making it hideous rather than the sparkling vampires with the strigoi. I mean, there could be nothing more disgusting than something that literally sucks your blood out with a tongue about 3 feet long, and then voids itself with on itself and smells like methane. I mean, it's just like this horrible image, and yet, I mean, it works.
Yeah.
Because death is ugly in many ways. To some, it's a release, and others, it's a grotesquerie. So it really depends on how you want to treat the discussion of death itself. And again, the message is, the monster is metaphor. How are we going to explore that concept?
And I think one of the other factors in that is going through history and time. Where did it become more powerful to push people to be more life obsessed as opposed to respecting a balance with death? Because it represents all of those things. It represents a greater cycle of existence. And even feeding on that fear about what that cycle means, which it comes back to, like I said, the zombie, that someone was powerful enough to pull you away from the god or whatever you believed in to basically be stuck here on Earth. And that idea of death never leaving Earth. And there's other ways we can also look at that is if you go into any culture's creation cosmology. Where does death sit and how did death come about within it to be able to set why is this considered a monster or why was this something that was considered equal in life? And that's not a structure that when you get into the power dynamics of the world that we live in now, the idea that death is more powerful than somebody. They don't like that idea that there is something more powerful than them. And that's nature, that's the universe. So how do they have control over that power? Just like the idea of dealing with a child having a nightlight. What do you do to give them this sense of power? You put the nightlight in. You go through a process of making sure that the room is safe. That same sense of we do relegate, like you said, to the outside edges, death and everything that's related to it. But we're all going to deal with death. We're all going to deal with grief of that loved one in our family, that neighbor down that street, or as we're dealing with now, the death across the world from other behaviors. Because that's another classic monster we haven't even talked about, the Grim Reaper.
Yes.
I was going to kind of say, yeah, what you were saying there definitely made me think that we've kind of missed one in that, I mean, the angel of death or just angels and demons in general might be considered classic monsters. I mean, definitely if you look at old black and white film, the devil and demons kind of show up in those early horror films in one form or another.
And that also ties into the idea of the cult as well.
Okay.
Because how often is the idea that it's a demon cult or a devil cult that's involved there? So there's even the aspect of the cult as a classic monster too.
Yeah.
So that raises an interesting question there, Perry. The idea of the group monster versus the individual monster. Like Dracula, for example, and generally vampires as a whole, we tend to see individually. Dracula shows up, and yes, he's got his little harem, but for the most part, we're focused on Dracula, the individual. But you mentioned a cult, for example, that's a large group of people. With werewolves, we often see multiple werewolves together. Zombies, sometimes it's one in some of the older stuff like you were talking about. But in modern times, it's a lot more of a horde. So can we dig a little bit into this idea of the individual monster, quote unquote, versus the collective?
So I'll start with this because this was one of our conversation points when we were preparing for this. So let me set the scene. I happen to be dealing with a bunch of things. My cousin is watching the werewolf movie with Benicio del Toro, and I happen to walk through the room at the scene where the love interest is talking to the gypsy or the Romana individual. And I'd also say the idea of the gypsy as another variant of the hag or the witch is something to be considered. But the Roma people having the idea of they have done this ultimate, the worst possible curse you could put onto somebody that has no fix. And as I was walking through and thinking about it, it's like, wait a minute, this idea of that they have to rescue this one person kind of goes counter to the thinking about this culture of the Romana, and in this case, the Gypsy, being that they're a collective group. They're a collective and taking care of themselves and what they do, because what happens with one is reflected on everybody else, the monolithic theory. So you just put a curse on somebody that is so destructive that he's going to start, or she is going to start taking out their own community. This is not a punishment on the individual. This is a punishment on the community for not maintaining its members' behavior as well, to the point where that member, as the werewolf, is now going to destroy that community for their inability to regulate them. And I think that becomes that part of what we then start seeing with the cult, is the idea that there's a group of people who, for whatever reasons, have fallen prey to this devil, have fallen prey to this elder god, because there's something that they are finding in the general existence they no longer find power in or find a place in. And this is even what comes back to the problem with Godzilla, because he was originally created as an anti-war monster, and distrust of large government. And that it took, in the most recent Godzilla -1, it took the public banding together to be able to take out Godzilla. So the standpoint of the collective is something that, especially from the Western standpoint that deals so much with individuals, is a struggle point. I'll turn it the rest to go from there.
It puts me in mind of some of the more recent kind of reversal portrayals of Lovecraft's Innsmouth, and the idea that, I mean, the Innsmouth folk, that you can view the Innsmouth folk with sympathy, in that they brought in this this other this other from under the ocean, in order to sustain themselves in a world that wasn't allowing them to sustain themselves. They were starving. They couldn't find fish. They couldn't find trade goods. All of these things that you need to exist in the modern world, or their modern world, and they went and made this bargain that, as a community, made them safe. I think that's definitely something worth looking at when you consider, well, any monster, or just, well, kind of a classic monster in general. Is you need to think about, what's your scale going to be. I mean, are we talking about kind of one family dealing with dealing with an individual, or one community dealing with an individual who is monstrous in some way, or are we talking about one community that is treaded on the boundaries of another community and caused harm, and so there's repercussions for that? I think that yeah, I think Perry brings up some very good points there. That it's worth, I mean, any time you're going to use one of these monsters, or really any monster, build any horror story, you want to think about what your scale is and where the impact is.
I totally agree with that. I mean, and monsters don't need to. I mean, you can really play with a classic monster in different ways. For example, the classic doppelganger. I love how Satoshi Kon does it in Perfect Blue, where basically society is literally pushing down on this person to change them, and their struggle with this doppelganger of, I want to be this person, I see this other person in the mirror, which one is actually me. And the entire movie is basically that struggle of the outside pushing in to reshape this person's personality and how they have to struggle with that.
Which we also see in like Invasions of the Body Snatchers.
Or even one of the recent Doctor Who Christmas specials dealt
Mhm.
with kind of a doppelganger idea, the idea of a nothing coming in and finding a something, and then the only thing that it can really reflect is that something. So it has to it has to intrude, it has to exist, but at the same time that you're taking away self, you're taking away agency from someone else by having an exact duplicate of them.
Mhm. And what is it
Clive Barker.
reflecting?
Yeah, I mean, Clive, I can't. The name of the short story eludes me at the moment, but Clive Barker did one where basically the doppelganger literally lived his life better. So he just basically gave up and let the doppelganger live his life.
And even Red Dwarf did that too with a particular episode with the judge at the end of the universe. The opportunity, what would be the opportunity that would be had by another view of the potential universes?
Talking about some more modern ways that we see these themes playing out with, for example, the Nothing from Doctor Who or Red Dwarf, or I was thinking The Thing, right, from one of my all-time favorite movies. And how do we see the themes of the classics being played out in modern monsters, modern popular culture? Because Perry, you mentioned earlier the modern classic monster, right?
Mhm.
So how do we see some of these themes and these creatures in the modern day?
I'm
In a day
quite
where Lucifer shows up and runs a bar and solves murder mysteries.
recently. I was watching a show called iZombie. I believe it's based on a comic which I haven't read, but in the TV show, it's a very different take on zombies to the usual shambling hordes, and it's an infection in a similar kind of way. I think in the show it was caused by an energy drink.
I'll
It's
actually, well, oh, sorry, I was going to say, Sue, I actually wanted to ask you something related to this, and I wanted to hear your opinion, your take on the idea that modern UFO lore, modern UFO legend, is an outgrowth of fairy lore.
Yeah,
The
that does
idea
make a lot
of
of sense.
the idea of abduction and things like that, of people going missing, of missing time, and how that is a. But I was curious if you'd read anything on that, because you seem to be up on your fairies and enjoy your fairies. So I was just curious about that, if that had ever come up for you.
So I'm not as up on UFOs as I am on fairies. And I've got a little bit of familiarity with how UFO research is currently going. And if you're curious, current UFOs do seem to look like clouds of balloons.
Nope.
I think the classic triangular shape, I think, pretty much went away after the stealth bombers appeared, and everyone just went, "Oh, that's a B-2 stealth bomber," instead of, "I don't know what that is." But yeah, recent UFO videos, to me, they look like clouds of balloons.
Which easily brings into the Jordan Peele's movie Nope as well, which
Mhm.
involves a very much a blend of UFOs and a Cthulhu monster as well. If anything, what we probably are looking at is both a greater understanding of the world in science, and how are these monsters getting updated to fit into that understanding and paradigm, such as the idea that I think it was the Strain, the Underworld series, all treated the vampire and the werewolf transformation as some sort of virus that was being imparted that caused the transformation. Was just recently, cousin was watching Blood Red Sky or Blood Red Air. It was on Netflix, but it was again the standpoint of, even though the person hadn't done the full blood exchange is classic myth, but they had been bitten. And there even brings up the premise of rabies, how something is transmitted.
Mhm. And as Perry mentioned, nope. Again, the monster is, and kind of the underlying theme is spectacle and our obsession with spectacle. All these characters are chasing this thing to be a part of something more than them. And in doing so, not to give too many spoilers away, a lot of them get killed because of as a result.
They join the cult of spectacle.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to a conversation we were having yesterday about gaming in history, the aspect of the mythos or devil or angel on the shoulder that just gives the push.
Absolutely.
There
Is
has
this
been
idea of... Oh, sorry, Sue. Go ahead.
so there does seem to be a bit of a modern attempt to look for a scientific explanation for a monster appearing. Diseases are a fairly common one, and so in the panel on nature, I've mentioned The Last of Us, where the zombies are there caused by a cordyceps fungus infection. Infection. Don't know where that word came from.
So there's an aspect of how has our understanding of the world, especially through science, changed when we're looking at most of these monsters originally through spirituality and religion to understand the world and nature around us.
Yeah, you kind of have to decide that as you're deciding your scale in your game. What's going to, are you going to have an underlying spiritual truth, or are you going to have an underlying scientific truth? Because I mean, in that, there are other questions you need to answer at that point. If God is real at your gaming table, that doesn't just mean that like vampires come from hell. That there's other questions then that you need to answer.
Exactly. Yeah.
That come out of that.
For example, like Childhood's End, which for those who know the series, the aliens look like demons.
Mm-hmm.
Is that actually God, or again the evolutionary experiences on different environments? Which we also know, which is also one of the things we've seen on our world as well, how the same species can evolve depending on different environmental factors.
Talking about using science versus spirituality in our games, we can move more into talking about how we use these things in games. And how have you seen these classic monsters and their concepts used in gaming? If you have seen them, if you've come across scenarios and games where, if you play Cult, I'm sure there's plenty of the angels and demons and things in there. So how have you seen these used in gaming so far?
I wrote a list for this one. Do you mind if I read my list?
Go ahead.
Okay, so the again, this is again everything I kind of wrote here was for vampires. So the three vampire, or I should say, yeah, the four vampires that at least I'm familiar with in kind of classic Call of Cthulhu. I'm going to say that if you're here right now in the audience, there are spoilers for things. So spoilers for The Haunting and things like that. Mr. Corbett, I would say, is a classic vampire, actually kind of a pre-movie vampire. Comp Fenelick is definitely a vampire. Baron Hauptmann, I don't think, I think his campaign was the fungi from Yoggoth. He showed up in that. I think more recently he's shown up in a Dark Adventure Radio Theater, an HBLHS. Kind of a radio play. And he's kind of, well, again, he lampshades certain aspects of the vampire, but also cuts under the trope because he's not really a vampire. He's a sorcerer who's jumping bodies. And then, of course, you have kind of the extraterrestrial monster, the star vampire, the fire vampire, the feeding thing, but it's definitely not human. That's my list.
Which kind of fits very much with the archetypes that Jason was putting forth too.
Yeah. Anybody seen a lot of werewolves in Call of Cthulhu or Call of Cthulhu scenarios?
Only in Masks of Nyarlathotep.
Okay. Yeah, there is. Yeah, and that's another sort of situation of kind of the folklore being thrown over the top of something there, because I mean you have the ghoul that is kind of masquerading as the werewolf.
Hmm.
Or is it that the closest explanation they can give to those locally is to think of a werewolf?
Yeah.
Hmm. I mean, it's kind of a corny movie, but I absolutely loved the Brotherhood of the Wolf, where everybody thought it was a werewolf. And I'm not going to, again, no spoilers, even though it's like 20 years old. It was definitely not a werewolf, but they built an entire mythology on it. And what was really interesting, going back to my discussion with Perry yesterday in history, that it was an actual event in history, and then they basically, took that concept and made it their own in an absolutely glorious way. I mean, martial arts in France with werewolves. I mean, it's just
Well, there is the martial arts savate, I believe it is known as, which was used much more for French sailors. But that standpoint of how much is what we were talking about, even with that, is just not another modern version of propaganda management
mhm.
and spin doctoring.
Oh yeah.
JR, how have you used some classic monsters as we've defined them in our discussion so far?
I guess the most recent would be with Blood Dipped Wings, where uh, literally the start of the story is people are a group of people who have their own personal traumas have come together to drive across the United States to escape their past, and they literally run an angel over in the middle of the highway and have to deal with that. And the angels in Cult Divinity Lost are reflections of different aspects of psychology, because God has left the building, so to speak, and the angels are left behind, you know, to deal with that, to try to keep our world together. And like in the movie The Prophecy, not all of the angels are benevolent. They actually hate humanity because God loved them. So that jealousy comes out. And as the story progresses, basically the angel offers them different deals. That some of them are much worse than others, and allows them to go down that rabbit hole into their trauma.
What about
Because
you,
there's a
Sue? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just about to say that also brings up the classic monsters of the hitchhiker and then the crossroad demon.
Mhm. In fact, I wove that in. The god of the highway. That basically a god that any road in the United States, it has influence over. So it can appear at any point in the entire United States. And if you actually take a look at our maps, that's a lot of space.
So I've used the God of the Highways in my own cult campaign, because it was set in Birmingham, very close to Spaghetti Junction, and I thought that's a lot of roads in a very small amount of space. If the God of the Highways is going to show up anywhere, it's going to be there. It's like the ultimate crossroads. It's I have noticed that cult has a way of doing both vampires and werewolves, but you don't actually see them all that often in cult scenarios. So I have used vampires once myself. The theme of the scenario was compulsion, which is one of the primary influences in the cult cosmology, and vampires seem to absolutely fit in with that.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, in cult you can have a sorcerer or a magician build themselves into a monster that way. That's, I mean, I did a fan project for cult a while back, and that was a favorite thing that I did, and definitely something that's gotten a little bit of traction. People seem to like it, and it was I built a vampire and I put her in a senior care facility. I thought that was a very kind of fitting sort of. It was just based on my experiences as a volunteer in high school and some of the things that I saw and lived through in a low income senior care facility, and yeah, but yeah, it kind of cult gives you that kind of, especially the new cult, the newest version, gives you that kind of plasticity with your monsters. You can really play with and adapt things to what you need in the moment, or in your scenario.
Which also then brings up in what you're just saying there too is, I'm going to use the vampire as a perfect example of it. Blood is the default for a vampire. But what if a vampire is feeding off of energy or emotion? What would that look like? And I think that's an area of further development for what we see in these environments, because you could easily write one based off of your experience in that care home that would fit an emotional vampire or an energy vampire.
Yeah. Actually, that puts me in mind of second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. One of the first kind of really, wow, you could do this with a vampire sort of eye-opening moments for me. There was, in the Ravenloft setting, there was a vampire that fed off cerebral spinal fluid.
Oh, they haven't had that in Charm too.
Yeah, that is, I thought that was a remarkable idea. I never really even considered it, but yeah, you could move beyond. I think it's worth talking about blood, but you could also move beyond blood.
And fringe as well.
In Dark Conspiracy, one of my favorite vampires was that they ate or consumed body heat. So people kept on finding these bodies, people that had died of hypothermia in the middle of New Orleans in high summer. Just
One of those shows up in Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere as well. She's calling herself a velvet. They never really explain exactly what she is, but what she does is steal heat from the main character.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and
Actually,
one side with the home that just kind of reminded me of a comedy horror, Bubba Hotep, where a mummy basically takes up residence inside of a nursing home, and Elvis and John Kennedy have to save the day.
so
So
what
my
are
favorite?
Hmm?
My
Sorry?
favorite take on an energy vampire is from a comedy horror. That's What We Do in the Shadows.
That's a great one.
Yeah,
Great
so
example
I've got characters like Colin Robinson showing up in other games I run now.
That's a great example of taking the trope and bending it, because that guy, I'm not overly familiar with the series, but that guy is everything that Dracula is not. In that he is the most aromantic individual that you could kind of craft, and yet he has all of the vampire he has all the vampire powers.
And another way of using that sort of classic aspect is what we've seen now, especially following the pandemic, of the massive rates of burnout people are experiencing. As I know, especially in my field, the aspect of vicarious trauma is one of those things that burns a lot of us out if you don't learn to manage it.
Along those lines of taking tropes and changing them, or shaking up expectations, what are some other monsters we can do that with, or that you have seen it done? Because we've talked a lot about vampires with Colin Robinson and cerebrospinal fluid and all these other really, really creepy. That cerebrospinal fluid one makes me go, ugh. But what are some things you've seen done, or that we can do with other monsters to twist and play with some of these tropes and mess with people's expectations a bit in the games?
Well, the first one that comes to mind, especially the creature of the Black Lagoon, we go back to one of the X-Files episode with the monster that lived in the sewage,
Luke.
which would be a variant on the creature from the Black Lagoon.
Mm-hmm.
That would be an example. What type of liquids and fluids are around that something could live in?
Speaking of fate, personally one of the most terrifying creatures in Chill is the old lady across the street, which is basically a hag, and uh, her entire purpose is she moves into the neighborhood, starts stealing children, turning neighbors against one another, and just basically drinking in the energy of all the chaos and paranoia that she's invoking.
So something I was thinking about the other day, sort of the drama that you could create with a zombie, but the individual retains all of their mental faculties. I suppose it's kind of like the iZombie, although I haven't seen it, but the idea that you could, have the funeral for your relative or something like that, or your neighbor or your friend or your loved one, and then they just show up again. And the drama that would involve in just watching this individual corrode and go through the process. There's no monstrousness. There's no monstrous behavior. They're not trying to bite you or anything like that. It's just more of my brain won't shut off. My body is decaying. What's happening to me? You could bend the monster into something sad, something that you could take sympathy from. You could do that, well, really with a lot of different monsters. The idea, if you play up their humanness, I mean, you could have a werewolf or a revenant or something like that. That is a creature of pity, and a creature that you could dramatize then, if you wanted to kind of sell your game in a different direction. It'd be a dark direction, but you could do it.
Frightening example of that would be, let's say the mind's still going, the body's decaying, someone dealing with ADHD. The mind never stops, even if the body can't keep up.
Yeah. JR, were you taking notes on my idea there?
No.
Patent pending. Patent pending.
if
I'm sure everyone listening is.
Yeah.
So I can think of an example of a zombie as a tragic figure in popular culture. There's a British TV show called Being Human. There's one episode of it, which I remember, it's called Type 4. And it's well, I wouldn't say it's the most tragic episode of the series, but that's only because it's an incredibly depressing TV show at times.
Mhm.
That episode was one of the particularly tragic ones. There's this woman who's basically become a zombie because she's been prevented from dying when she should, and is having to deal with the fact that her body is rotting away.
Clive Barker's The Damnation Game kind of explores that, where basically the antagonist can literally kill a person and keep them going, and that's his punishment: is you do what I say and I'll eventually let you die. But in the meantime, your body is going to continue rotting and decaying until the point that you won't be able to move, so you better hop to.
Which is the example of the zombie that's based out of African American folklore. Another thought would be the idea of using the situation people are dealing with drug abuse and such. How do they become the zombie there because of the drug?
Yeah, addiction is an interesting one where you could really play with that whole monster as metaphor option.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to offer one other thought with regard to the kind of how can you twist the idea. There is a web series, although I cannot recall the name of it. Maybe one of you can. I believe it's all done in black and white, and it's kind of done in these little vignettes. But ultimately, the idea is that you have kind of UFO-style aliens trying to contact human beings, but they're microorganisms. So it's essentially like a bacteria that has sentience, trying to contact human beings, and kind of how that ends up looking, because of course we can't hear them. So they have to get inside of our bodies and change our behavior and things like that to indicate. I thought that was kind of an interesting take. If we allow the UFO alien into the classic monster group.
Well, it's also another which we didn't get into yesterday is the idea of assimilation as a monster in and of itself too, which
Yes.
can fit in with a conformity standpoint, but even just to be able to communicate how much assimilation is necessary for there now to be a common language.
Yeah, I mean, in The Thing, isn't it actually a villain? It's just trying to live by taking us over, but is it doing us a favor, or is it actually, erasing who we are?
Actually address that in the book version, where one of the characters, I can't remember who, 'cause it's been a bit since I've read it, calls the thing evil, and the doctor says, "Evil? How can you call it evil? You don't know what its expressions look like. You don't know what it wants. You don't know why it's doing what it's doing. It's trying to survive, and the things that you think of as evil in our context are not evil necessarily to it."
Yeah, zoom out far enough, and villainy is really just a matter of perspective.
So there's this something we've been talking about in this part of the discussion is sort of humanizing a lot of these monsters, these creatures, and so on. With iZombie, for example, being a big one there, where she is still human, or the vegetarian vampires in Twilight, and just humanizing a lot of these creatures in modern pop culture. Do you think we see a lot of that in gaming as well, or do we tend to revert back more to the otherness of them and keeping them as other, as we see them in more classic portrayals?
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful game, a series of games, but in many ways, the World of Darkness didn't do the classic monsters any favors, because they've transformed. A lot of these games have transformed, vampires into this sparkly people. They're sexy people hanging around, smoking cigarettes and talking poetry. And a lot of you have to actually dig to get into the horror aspects, which is counterintuitive to the whole purpose of the game. Even the werewolves, they're the immune system of Gaia. But we again, unless your GM is trying to actually explore the horror of being a werewolf, of losing control of yourself, of being in the thralls of a higher power, it kind of loses the true aspects of the classic monster.
I don't think we see a lot of the classic werewolf in horror games. I mean, pretty much the only time I've seen werewolf as a curse has been when I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons.
I think.
Yep. Go ahead.
Go on.
No.
Okay. I think that in a short scenario, it is. I mean, unless your intention is to create kind of that humanity, or is to sympathize with the monster. In a short scenario, it's very easy to have unsympathetic monsters. I think if you're going to have a campaign, I recall this because I just kind of recall my experience with Masks of Nyarlathotep. If you're going to run a long-term campaign, you need to give these creatures and the people that work with them motivations and reasons beyond the simple "I am a monster, I want to eat you" sort of thing. Because I mean, your players, and particularly the way kind of these old campaigns are getting rewritten now. I mean, your characters are going to repeatedly kind of deal with these characters over and over again. And so you need to, in some ways, kind of provide them with at least a little bit of sympathy, a little bit of a guide that lets them be something more than a cardboard cutout. because otherwise, I mean, 30 sessions in, it's going to get kind of tiring. But if you can, give something like, and in this case, I'm saying sort of like the cults of Nyarlathotep as kind of the monsters there. If you can give them an angle, if you can give them something that your characters or the players of your characters are willing to sympathize with, then I think you're in a better position to kind of run those campaigns long term. Because otherwise, it just gets kind of it becomes a slog.
You got to find that balance. Yeah.
Yeah. I think in that case, I think sympathy saves that sort of that kind of gaming. I think having that kind of sympathy for the monster is something that makes campaigns possible long term.
And that gets back to the scale question too.
Mm-hmm.
Short term, one offs, yeah, they can be that. But versus what is that? And this gets back to our conversation yesterday about power. I mean, Mask of N. As I'm listening to it on the old ways right now, I can easily see why the cult of the bloody tongue comes into existence as colonial powers are coming in and ripping up the land and saying you don't belong here, treating you who have been long-term residents like shit. Mm-hmm. And now this, again, mythic entity just taps on the door saying, I can give you power, but you do, to make sure you're giving the other end of the bargain, is take their lives, convert them over to me. How is that not a response that will happen when given the chance? And that's out of a deeper response of fear to basically survive. And that survival instinct, which everybody has, and can mean it will go against your fellow human too.
When you can empathize with the monster, it does become more powerful. The whole concept resonates a lot deeper.
In cosmic horror, it's kind of handy to have those characters, those beings like Nyarlathotep, that kind of trickster figure that can actually reach out and touch humanity and communicate with humanity, as opposed to just being a distant cosmic entity. I would say listening to podcasts of Scott Dorward GMing, the idea of, I mean, this was, again, something that kind of saved my campaign that I ran, was the idea that Nyarlathotep isn't just a villain, but is maybe trying to inculcate or pull in the PCs here and there, giving them options. If they open a door to something magical, there's the option that Nyarlathotep, like Perry was saying, is just going to offer that tap and say, hey, you could get everything you want, just do it my way.
And further aspect, think of Nyarlathotep as an energy vampire, feeding off of all, not just the physical blood and all that, but the emotional energy that is generated by the chaos these people bring.
I did that with I did that with the God of the Highway. Basically, it offered the players, I can give you an easy road if you do this seemingly simple thing, which was stick a nail in a tire. Later on in the that scenario, they found the car that they stuck the nail in abandoned and the family wiped out. They basically fed the God of the Highway this family without even thinking about it. So they got what they wanted, but now they have to deal with the consequences thereof.
Which actually brings up the idea of the monkey's paw as a monster and villain too.
Mm-hmm. And that is another way you could actually bring in any number of these classic monsters. If you wanted to kind of twist it a little bit, you bring them in not as a person, but as an artifact, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you'd have to think about the way to do it necessarily, but I mean, you could take kind of the creature that you want to play with and then work it into an artifact that then you just throw this object at your PCs and there's your game. as they have to deal with this artifact and people who want it, people who don't want it, etc.
I think in a way, Rina, your Click Clack story is an example of that with the typewriter.
I use a lot of Penny Dreadful monsters in that particular scenario, but it's all channeled through a haunted typewriter. So, but I love that idea of using an artifact or using an object, kind of like the One Ring from Lord of the Rings, right? It's essentially the energy vampire itself as an object. So I really love that idea.
Was it the Twilight Zone episode, The Button?
Mm.
You press this button, somebody you don't know will die, but you'll get $1 million. And when they take it, well, who's it going to go to? Somebody you don't know.
But now that you've taken the money, you're
Yeah.
on the list of people who can now die.
Yeah.
So talking about empathy and feeling connections to monsters, to the villains, what are some pitfalls to avoid there when building empathy, when building that connection? If I was writing a story and I wanted to build a relationship or build sympathy for a version of Dracula or some other monster, what are some pitfalls to avoid there?
For me, it's excusism. When you drift too far from empathy, where you can understand their motivations to the point that you dismiss or accept what their motivations have done. So, for example, with Dracula, yes, I can understand that he's trying to save his people. He's trying to save his perfect love. It does not excuse the fact that he has butchered all these people.
Keep your monster monstrous.
Yeah.
And this is what I was saying yesterday about there's the intent and then there's the impact. If we just always stayed on intent, those are all wonderful, but intent generates this impact, cause and effect. You just stay in cause, you never know what the effect is, and the effect is what's moving through the world. And that effect causes something else, that chain reaction. And that is why, like the excusism or exceptionalism, you're ignoring the impact, so that has to be the thing that counterbalances the empathy.
And in some ways, on the opposite end, if you just focus on the impact, it almost in some ways just basically dismisses what the person. I mean, it is a person that has done this. Why have they done this? And if you actually begin examining that, it becomes a lot more insidious, because what is differentiating you from them? What would push you to do these horrible acts? And the more you explore that, the more it eats at your soul, which is the core of horror.
Or a
there any
simpler aspect of, what are you willing to sacrifice to have this happen?
Any situations where you should keep that kind of remove from these monsters, these villains, from the players, where you don't build that kind of empathy or that connection to them?
Well, a lot of the harbingers, the Cthulhu mythos, so to speak, these unknowable entities, you can't really empathize with Cthulhu because it is a completely alien concept. And that's where the terror lies, that you cannot understand it and why it does it. Its motivations are its own. You will never be able to comprehend that.
I think the same applies to some of the Fae. And if you start humanizing them too much, they lose their alien quality. Part of what makes the Fae interesting is that they are operating under a completely different set of rules to us.
Been thinking that it's important to make sure that you don't have cardboard cutout victims either. You don't want your monster to be cardboard cutout. You don't want your victims to be cardboard cutout either. I think that's kind of my interpretation of what JR and Perry were saying there.
Yeah, which also brings us back to earlier subject of death with
Mhm.
your loved one, your neighbor. These are people who have had some sort of role, significance in your life for however long and have had some sort of meaning to it. So the idea that this person was killed the night before their wedding night,
Mhm.
what does that now generate inside of you? Or the day before they were going to leave on their trip to Paris after graduating high school, a la
Yeah.
Final Destination.
Yeah, no, there's ripples that are created every time you create a victim,
Hmm.
and it's worth exploring those ripples.
And that also comes with seeing if the death of this character has happened off screen, looking at the people that were left behind and affected by that as part of that mechanism of bringing in the sympathy even for the victim too. You're meeting their grieving family member or fiance or classmates.
I think that's why a lot of J horror is very insidious. For example, the Grudge. The victim suffered horribly, and it created a curse. But the horror isn't, you're not dealing with the victim anymore. You're dealing with that stain of trauma that is begun to manifest, and it has absolutely no compassion. The moment you enter that house, you are dead. You can't reason with it. You can't sympathize with it. You are now marked. You are done for. And no matter how much backstory or how the victim went, what they went through, nothing can justify the fact that just by opening a door, you are now dead.
I think one more thing that I want to bring up. I feel like I missed my opportunity for this, but I do want to get everybody's thoughts on this. When we talk about these kind of classic monsters, I think there's a chance that, and one way you could play it that would be a little different is that there are examples, or not examples, I would say that there are ways that you could make all of these monsters, or at least a lot of them, just human beings. One story that I dug into a while back was the Kentucky vampire killings. This happened in the 1990s. It was kind of seminal for me because it was about the same time that I discovered Vampire the Masquerade, and this was kind of a teenage cult that got out of hand with LARPing.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, they there was a kid leading this cult that got a hold of kind of it was kind of on the bad side of how to win friends and influence people, and so he was able to convince his buddies to help him rob and kill a couple of people. And so I mean that is an example of I mean there's this kind of vampire quality to it, but it's entirely human. You could do it with a werewolf too. I suppose you could even do it with like the creature from the Black Lagoon if people were all willing to just live in the swamp. But I mean, yeah, you could find ways to make it just human beings that are behind these awful atrocities. And I think that's something, if I can point back to kind of what Rina was saying with, what do you want to kind of keep away from? What do you want to kind of expose your players to, but also give some distance? Keep in mind that people are capable of these awful things as well. This is not something that is unique to monsters. These are all, I mean, kidnapping each other, killing each other, maiming each other, um, um, tormenting each other emotionally, mind control, mind manipulation, that sort of stuff. This is all stuff that just people are capable of.
Yeah. The Japanese anime Hell Girl is a perfect example of that. Because there comes a point in the anime where an entire town is calling on Hell Girl's services because they just don't like their neighbors.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Not
And,
because of her influencing thing. They are the ones calling on her, not the other way around.
and in many ways, that's why we invent monsters. It's just easier to create a boogeyman than to accept that my neighbor could literally torture their own child to death.
Yeah. Or that we could go walking in the woods and go missing.
Hmm.
So
This conversation got very cheerful all of a sudden.
very cheerful.
But that's also, but that again becomes the standpoint of how we're balancing the idea of the monster. It's easier in that sense to other the monster
Yeah.
than look at the aspect of we've actually done this. And that's even the balancing point we do with the idea of the cult. The cult is here's your neighbor. The cult is
Yeah.
your music teacher. The cult is the waitress at the diner. The cult is your new boyfriend.
All around you.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't escape if you wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing I will add with and this is kind of an afterthought, but with regard to how do you deal with your players, what do you expose them to, what do you not? When I was just mentioning that this conversation got very cheerful, give your players space.
Yeah.
Give them an opportunity to laugh a little bit. Give levity. If you're gonna, I mean, in this really goes in any campaign. Horror requires those breaks, those moments of kind of calm between the panic and the tension. You need those you need to have that opportunity for those cute interactions. You need to have the opportunity for everyone to laugh, because then you have something to lose. But also, you're not ratcheting up the tension to the point that your players aren't able to keep up with it. Because I mean, it's like tensing a muscle. You make everything so intense that that you just give out eventually, and your players are just like, okay, just get it over with. Have the thing eat me, whatever.
Yeah, this is the principle of fear fatigue.
Okay.
And it can happen on a variety of levels, but it reaches a point where the idea that of what you are afraid of or what you're anxious of reaches a point where it's just so inevitable that it doesn't matter anymore. And we have seen this in many different forms in the regular world. I mean, perfect
I get that
example.
every time I fly on a plane.
Every time we fly on a plane, but I mean,
Yeah.
notice how the world got to a point in the second year of the pandemic. How many people were just now, in some cases, purposely going out to get COVID just so they would have it over with.
Yeah.
And this is an aspect, and it's also been seen in the AIDS crisis as well. But this is something that psychologically, the mind and the body were never designed to stay in that state forever. They're meant to be momentary moments. Prolonged crisis will start having the system break down. And that's gets into the sense of the fear fatigue.
And I think that gets to the root of why we do what we do. I mean, if you ask a normal person, uh, or tell a normal person, I'm going to go play a horror game where I'm going to be a character being, tortured by alien monstrosities, they'll look at you like you're nuts. But it's like getting on a roller coaster. It's cathartic. You can actually help deal with the horrors of reality just by experiencing something fantastical.
And it's control, which is one of the questions I know has come up for a number of marginalized people. Why do we love horror? Some of the stuff we see is because there's a simple fact that we can turn off the television at some point. We can put the book down. We can stop listening to the podcast as opposed to the rest of our lives where we can't. And that horror is coming from our fellow humans.
So, one final large question I have for everyone, just for fun, is I'd like to know here at the end, coming up on the end of our panel, from each of you, if you were writing a scenario now and you were involving a classic monster, which one would you use, and why would you use it?
Well, right now I would really like to write something involving a classic werewolf and do it as the curse rather than how most games seem to play it as at the moment as the player character of the wolf pack, who are often kind of into eco stuff. I'd like to go back to the original roots and make the werewolf itself the horror.
Well, as you were saying that, I was writing down something. I was writing down an idea for an actual monster that came to mind while we're having this discussion, and that was I'd like to do something with the Sin Eater. That basically that figure that comes in and consumes our sins, and then they're always on the outside of society. So I'd like to explore that concept of the outsider that can, comes in and takes away our so-called pains.
Well, I would say, because this is actually a nightmare turned dream that I had dream turned nightmare last night that I had that sort of has sort of this ghost grudge, and I realized, oh, I can connect this to a song that I happen to particularly like as well. That is based in the trauma of African American horror as well, and history in this country. So it's like, okay, so how to start putting that together? I made my keynotes about what are the things that are involved.
I don't know what monster I would prefer to use. I mean, obviously, I've talked a lot about vampires here, and I've definitely messed around with that subject before. Maybe I'd like to move away from it, but what I would like to do, I think, right now, if I had my opportunity, it would be to. I'd like to look at a support group dealing with trauma from, well, some sort of monster, or maybe again, it's kind of a take on the Renfield movie that came out a while ago. The idea that a monster joins a support group. I would like to see something like that. I would like to see I would like to see a group of human beings in kind of a vulnerable situation in proximity with a monster and kind of see how they handle it.
Rina?
I have a scenario called Safe Space, which is a group of humans who've encountered the mythos in Call of
Yeah.
Cthulhu coming together for group therapy. But there's a lot of different things you can do with that kind of setup.
3 ideas been done.
There is nothing new under the sun.
No, there isn't. There's just the ways you
Mhm.
do it. But
And that's the biggest thing to also keep in mind, as we have so many of these monsters to use. How can you do it a little different?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Do
I
you
would love
play
to
it
use.
as the vampire going after the cerebral fluid or the emotion? Do you have the werewolf that, or it's not the werewolf, it's, like I said, the were-hyena?
Mm-hmm.
Because I know there's an entire class of another monster, which I know is African, that I am so looking forward to a point where I can actually sit down and create a story around it called Masquerades.
Okay.
And Nydia Okorafor has used them very much in her Akata Witch series. So it's another one I'd like to use that for myself.
you know something, you could take a rare creature and you could take a you could make a, I mean, the whole idea is that a human crosses with an animal, or a human sort of lets the beast that is in them out of them somehow. But what if you did that with a completely benign creature, but yet made it terrifying? A
Manicula.
were chicken,
We're sloth.
were cow, something like that. I bet you could do something with that. I bet you could do something terrifying with that.
Well, I think there are certain aspects of I think I've heard of something called a weresloth in another context. I can't, but I know it's a cultural one. Can't think of what it was, but it was just one of those things I heard in passing. I think it was Southeast Asia.
Well, they have done the zombie cow, and that was a great book. The Apocalypse Cow.
And there is the classic children's one of Banicula.
Yes.
The rabbit bunny.
I loved that story as a kid.
Banicula's great.
There's
But
the Aardman
Farms are
animations.
terrifying. Oh, sorry, Sue.
Yeah, there's the Aardman animations film, The Curse of the Were-Rabbit.
yeah.
I was just going to say, farms are terrifying, scary, smelly places, particularly when you're a kid.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, cows are a lot bigger than they look in pictures.
Well, I look forward to reading all of these scenarios when they come out, so no pressure whatsoever there. Do you have any final comments or notes that you'd like to leave our audience with?
Just go out and make monsters. Make them your own.
Explore the world, but be respectful of what you find in the world, too. If you're
Yes.
going to create it in another environment.
Yeah. Know what the monsters mean, too. I mean,
So go and read stuff about the classic monsters and see which bits you find fun.
Find the vampire tunnels in your community. They're around. I mean, if you're looking, if you want to know what I mean, Google or check into the Springfield vampire tunnels to kind of start you off as the idea. That's a wonderful piece of modern contemporary legend.
A variant of that would be Jordan Peele's Us with the Tethered.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for participating in this panel on classic monsters in horror games. I'd like to go around the table again and have y'all just remind everyone of where they can find you, find your work. So we'll start with Perry.
So I'd say at this point, my biggest one would be my podcast, which is Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered, which you can find on any podcast player, talking about the intersection of mental health and a variety of issues, which I have done some horror episodes, but I think I need to do a few more. As well as just checking out Symphony Entertainment. I'm on a few games there. And once I finally get my game done, we'll get it out there.
who next? I'm Jason Fryer. You can find me at the Otter Poets on the Twitter. I'm a writer, game designer, and general curmudgeon that did Cult Divinity Lost's Beyond Darkness and Madness. You can find me on Lost Caravan, either on the Discord or on the YouTubes. Currently doing the actual play of With Blood Dipped Wings. And hopefully in the future, we're going to be doing another actual play in Cult Divinity Lost, exploring surrealism and dreams in limbo.
I think Sue was saying Sue.
Yeah, I'm Sue Savage, and you can find some of my writing on DriveThruRPG. Just search for Sue Savage as the author, and that will bring up the things I've worked on. I also can be found on various socials under the name Savage Spiel. One of those is my blog on Blogspot, where you'll find write-ups of conventions I've been to, a bit of information about some of the scenarios I've written and where to find my stuff. And of course, you can also see me doing actual plays on Symphony Entertainment.
My name's Stephen Wall. You can find me at, or you can find my work at delaporemedia.com. DELAPORE media.com.
Thank you all for joining us. I have been Rina Haenze, your moderator for this evening. You can find me on the Old Ways podcast, Ain't Slayed Nobody, and DriveThruRPG. So, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your convention and have a good Sunday evening.